Welcome to Thrive Radio. I'm your host, Amy Montgomery, entrepreneur and digital marketing agency owner. Today, my guest is Brian Glibkowski. He is the founder of Raise Your AQ. He is helping leaders raise their answer intelligence, which is the ability to provide elevated answers to explain and predict in a complex world, emotionally connect, and achieve results. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Amy, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So can you share your journey with us and how did you come to create Raise Your AQ?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my background is in and out of academia. I did research on questions, and it sounds very basic. And when I was doing this research on questions, I'm a management professor, I realized we know a lot about questions. We know that there are 6 WH questions: why, what, how, when, where, who. Open and closed questions. Sales methodologies are based on questions. Coaching methodologies based on questions, etc. So I wanted to look at the answer side of the equation. And really, prior to my research, there wasn't a typology of different types of answers that you could use. So I did research with the top golf instructors in the world and did a TEDx talk, wrote a book, and basically developed this framework around answers that people can use to provide greater influence with others. So that's basically my journey in a nutshell.
What is your brand AQ and how do you communicate it?
Yeah. So I think the brand is, if we're asking a philosophical question, what's the brand? The book was just nominated for an award in London for the smart thinking category. So I think it's sort of taking a look at something we think we know and maybe reimagining what it is. We all think we understand what communication is, but have we really thought about answers? So I think we're working with a lot of professional service firms, coaches, trainers, and consultants that are interested in enabling important conversations. So I think maybe smart thinking could be the brand, if I could use a couple words, perhaps.
So why is it important to include metaphors in stories that we tell for our business?
Yeah, I think we're all very fascinated by stories. So if you ask someone answers they may provide, start talking about this topic, and they'll naturally gravitate towards stories. Stories are great. They respond to the why question. Why should I work with you? Why should I hire you? Provide a story. Metaphors are similar to stories in that they're both connected to experiences. They emotionally connect, but they relate to a different question. Metaphors answer the what question. What is leadership? What is innovation? You can provide a metaphor. And they serve different purposes. So we really want to focus on both, and the story to answer the why question, the metaphor for the what question. So for example, if you ask me what is leadership, I could describe a metaphor. I could say leadership is like 2 ropes. When they're separate, they're strong, but when they're braided together, they're even stronger. And that's how I lead. I inspire and hold people accountable. So it's a metaphor for what leadership is. Then I could follow that up with a story about how I inspire and hold people accountable simultaneously. So they're related, but they're distinct. And the last thing I'll say is metaphors are great because they're easier to tell. Storytelling takes oftentimes a little more skill in the delivery and build up. Metaphors don't. So if you like stories, you should incorporate metaphors as well.
So how can you have greater influence with a better AQ?
Yeah, I think if you take a step back, think about all the important conversations you've had. I'm talking to your audience here. You think of interviews. You can ask great questions during the interview. When are you going to get the job? When you provide answers, right? Compelling stories, procedures of how you work, actions. These are all answers in our framework. The same thing for sales. How do you win the business? You answer the proverbial question that keeps the executive up at night. So if you want to influence others, you need to provide effective answers.
How does AQ help you answer those questions that keep you up at night?
Yeah, so I think AQ gives you a framework to understand how questions are mapped to answers. So if you ask someone, how do we work with you? The 2 answers that maps to are procedures and actions. So you're sort of understanding specific types of answers, and it gives you something to aim at. Basically, procedures and actions are like a recipe for a cake. The 10 steps are the procedures. The actions are any given step, like cracking an egg. So what we found is that working with different organizations, whether it's around marketing or sales, for example, they're often missing complete sets of answers. So going back to metaphors, a company may have a story, why should you buy from you, but they haven't thought of metaphors. So if you don't have all the answers in your toolbox, you're not going to be able to fully connect with the questions being asked. So it's a framework that allows anyone to up-level their communication.
Can you give an example of somebody out there that has a brand and they want to use AQ for their brand? What's some low-hanging fruit that they can start to implement?
Yeah. So in my book, there's a chapter on brand AQ that's co-written by the CEO of a life insurance company, Paul Cronto, Boston Mutual Life Insurance Company of the Boston area. And he was very interested in his brand in AQ terms, sort of reflecting all these 6 answers. So something you can do that's very easy, relatively easy, is try to think about your brand in terms of 6 answers, document it, think about it, communicate it to others. So for example, take theory in our framework. It sounds very abstract, or business strategy. We tied the life insurance company's brand to the theory of strong families. Families that survived the Great Depression had 3 attributes. They're flexible, they're cohesive, and they communicated well, and they achieved goals. So that's a theory. A lot of the other organizations that have brands in the insurance industry maybe just throw around the word family, but it's not tied to something specific and concrete. When Boston Mutual has this idea of this strong family in mind, now they can think about procedures and actions that customer service is going to use to live the brand. They can map those to stories, et cetera, and so forth. So when you have all the answers, I think you have a fuller expression of what your brand identity is.
So let's talk about your book, Answer Intelligence, the answers to emotionally connect, explain, and predict and achieve results. Who is it for and how will it help them?
Yeah, the book is written for anyone that has important conversations, that wants to be more effective. It's written for individuals that have something to say. It sounds sort of trivial to make that point, but I wrote the book in part, I think, to help myself. I think it's sort of your own therapy. I always, felt like I had something to say and I couldn't quite communicate it. So this research and this process in part was to help me understand how I could be more effective with others. So if you're interested in elevating your conversations, whether it's around sales, marketing, culture, this is a book that can help you.
I think that's huge, especially I'm thinking in my world over here, digital marketing world, there's so many people that are wanting to create more video and short form video, and you only have like a few seconds to make that impact. I can see in that way, especially because of the view that I have of how much that would really impact a lot, right? There's so many people that start videos out. My name is Joe. I'm the science of whatever, the scientist, or what, like stuff that nobody cares about, right? That doesn't get anyone's attention. Instead of starting with, okay, you could start with a metaphor.
Right. Yeah. Start with a metaphor, start with the story. And I guess depending on the purpose of the video, even potentially getting into the procedures or actions of how your product works, but it's all sort of potentially, I guess, in moderation and the right timing for what you're trying to do. It really depends. And in the case of Boston Mutual, a lot of the advertising firms they're engaging with, they all focused on stories, which are great, but a brand is more than a story. There's 6 answers that have to be used, I think, to be effective. And that could, I'm sure, transfer over to videos and thinking about what you're conveying it for each of those videos.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So can you share some of your client success stories with us?
Yeah. So one success story, we had a client that was a sales coach that was working with a client that did big ticket project management work. And the engineers on this team had to pitch their prospect, which is one of these large resorts. They do resort developments. And the engineers were sort of concerned they had to pitch the board. And they weren't salespeople, so they were worried about that conversation. And our partner helped them develop 6 answers to frame their value proposition. And they actually went in and used we have a circular model of these answers. They presented the model with their answers on it. I wouldn't really recommend that. It's a little maybe artificial, but it worked. They won 2 projects, $2.5 million in fees, and now they're negotiating another 10 projects. And there's other examples like that, for example, related to marketing and branding. Currently working on a project where marketing developed personas, and now working with marketing and sales. The idea is to develop 6 answer types for each of the personas. So it's sort of extending the personas and making it real and giving the sales reps the content they need to have real conversations that are sort of extend the persona forward into that conversation space. So those are 2 examples of things we've been doing.
I like that. I think the personas can be so difficult, especially when you're trying to get into that individual's world from an emotional level. And you do that with all the sales copy. But if you're talking to somebody on the phone, I can see how using metaphors and having that answer IQ would be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, the framework is about questions and answers. So it's sort of an operational framework to navigate a conversation. A persona, when it's written on the page, may reference things like needs or different attributes, but that's not how you communicate. We communicate in questions and answers. So you need to have the persona transformed into answers that you can now use and provide to others.
Yeah, it excites me because I think how so many different ways you can utilize that. So if you were able to give yourself one piece of advice when you first started out on your journey, what would it be?
That's when I first started on the journey. I think one of the themes in the book is use all 6 answers. A friend of AQ, Mike Sonke, recently retired McDonald's USA CFO, estimates that about 60% of the value of AQ is knowing there's 6 answers. I don't know how many conversations I've had. I'm a professor in the classroom, outside the classroom, where I would just focus on a couple answers. A lot of like theory and concept, I'm wired towards that analytically. And I totally abdicated my responsibilities in other answer types. It didn't appeal to me, or I didn't understand I need to provide all the answers. For example, in the classroom, I would be the professor that has no textbook and no examples, and I would have them read academic articles. But now I understand I wasn't answering the how question. Students want to know how, do they negotiate or they lead or the different topics. And I wasn't giving them the answers they needed to succeed. So if I had to go backwards, I would tell myself to provide all the answers, as simple as that sounds, but it makes you more influential. And can listeners get all of those 6 in your book? You list them all in your book? Yes, all 6 answers are in the book. We have 5 high AQ practices that we learn from the top golf instructors of how they communicate effectively. You can also go to raiseyouraq.com. All the information's there about the 5 high AQ practices. And if I could point out, there's a free Explore AQ assessment that anyone can take. It takes about 5 minutes, and you can get an AQ score as well as a 10-page PDF report to guide you. So that's something I would encourage your listeners to check out. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise today. Thank you, Amy, for having me. It was a pleasure. Yeah. And if you're listening and want more information about this podcast and upcoming shows, you can visit acalltothrive.com. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful week.